I reflect on Elden Ring like this. Throughout my first and only playthrough, I would have played 60 or 70 hours in my first month, whereas the next 30 hours took another 2 months, purely because I felt burnt out. Gritty fantasy is my favourite genre. Dark Souls is my favourite franchise. Dark Souls 3, my most lauded title of all time. The weighty combat and NPCs that speak in broken Shakespearean prose and the godly art direction is juice straight into my veins. So an open world variation on this framework in the form of Elden Ring compelled me since its announcement. More than anything, it's pretty wild that From Software took their linear fighting games, known for their clever use of narrow corridors and labyrinths, and imported it into sprawling plains, beaches, and a massive world you need a horse to traverse, a horse that can double jump. Every aspect of Elden Ring as a project is impressive and worthy as praise. But Elden Ring is a long game. If you're like me and did every dungeon you came across, but probably nowhere near all of them, sought out every story boss and made a decent effort at following NPC questlines, you're probably looking at 100 hours at least on your first playthrough. And in a game that repeats its bosses and enemy varieties in later zones, that copies dungeons and has a pretty strict weapon upgrade system, that is a slog. That's too much time. That much content is not actually a great thing. Elden Ring was a 10 out of 10 best game of all time when I was battling through Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, and beneath the hateful red skies of Caelid. Unrivaled fun. I was still unashamedly addicted whilst roaming Leonia of the Lakes and Altus Plateau. Still a solid 9 out of 10, maybe an 8 when I reached Leandel. But after Morgott, those snowy mountain regions, Haligtree, Farum Azula, bloody hell, I was done. Exhausted, lethargic, 4 out of 10 misery. The zones are good, aesthetically incredible, plenty to marvel at just like those early areas, but I was tired. My charitability for reused assets, in particular standard enemies, was depleted, and it doesn't help these zones have some of the most bullshit bosses to ever haunt the franchise. So Elden Ring, much like the mythos behind Dark Souls, is a journey where you corrode and hollow and lose your former idealism the longer you play, until you're finally marching ahead with gritted teeth and sheer suffering just to get it done, when the sensible thing, the just thing, would be to stop, submit to entropy and let go. As an attempt to bring Soulsborne to the open world, what From Software have done is impressive. I think everyone and their dog knows that. It has marked an epoch in open world games, a time before Elden Ring and a time after Elden Ring, because the discovery, map mechanic, horse usage, legacy dungeons, open world bosses, and frankly every single part of the artistic design has blown every other open world game out of the water. This is the new high watermark. But sometimes I despised it, and that makes it pretty unique. The weakest part of Elden Ring was the story and narrative delivery, in my opinion. People who say that they can feel the strength of George R.R. Martin's narrative through the lore and world building, I say you're talking out of your ass. At best, he did dot points and reviewed a script, but most likely his name was just stamped onto the box at the height of Game of Thrones fever back in 2018. That's clever marketing, no complaints from me. But Elden Ring doesn't match the sheer commitment to themes and immersion of common messages and ideals that Dark Souls carried. Probably Bloodborne too, but I don't own a console, so I can't say for sure. Something in Elden Ring to me therefore feels like it's missing. It's a hard thing to articulate, but how I think about it is this. Playing any Dark Souls game blind, but especially the third game, I didn't necessarily understand the full scope of the lore or the nuanced meaning, but the environments, enemy design, and small flourishes of detail communicated the emotion I ought to be feeling, that the ashen grey world had overstayed its welcome and was doomed to die, that entropy is eternal and coming, and that to fight against it would be in vain, that you shouldn't hang on to anything, even life and order, too tightly. These themes were impossibly loud and supported from start to finish, but Elden Ring doesn't have quite the grand scope of central messaging. At times it feels like it's lacking an atmosphere or message that everything else is built upon. Now, at a smaller scale, some zones come close. Caelid, I think, is my favourite, a land tainted by scarlet rot, permanently overcast in a reddish hue, and suffering from nuclear fallout that has haunted the landscape, corrupted creatures, and even rotted the mind of Radahn, the zone's main boss. That is really well handled, but that's more of an exception in this game. Few zones match Dark Souls' level of organic storytelling, where the land and enemies and bosses often spoke to a consistent theme. That's all I have to say about the game holistically. Other people have spoken at greater length about Elden Ring. Instead, I want to hone in on some of the boss fights, because there are so many in Elden Ring and such a diversity of experience, from boredom to euphoria, and discuss my impression, how these uplifted the story or didn't, and the emotions these left me with. It doesn't help that there's less than probably 10 unique fights in the game, that Elden Ring would have benefited from trimming some of the fat. So because of that, you'll see I've been quite arbitrary in what I've elected to speak about. And because I was playing blind, I often actually wouldn't know when a boss fight was necessarily coming up. So sometimes I just didn't record a boss because I beat it on my first attempt and never had the opportunity to turn on the recording. In any case, if that sounds like fun to you, then I hope you keep on listening. So let's begin. So as much as I would like to discuss the first dragon encounter, Pumpkinhead or the Leonine Misbegotten, I hadn't actually decided to record my playthrough at that point. So this is where my recordings begin, in a forgotten corner of the Weeping Peninsula, my second encounter with the Evergaols. The Hero of Zamor was a fun one-off encounter, and at this early stage, the Evergaols were a compelling concept to me, but much like the Crucible Knights or Misbegotten fights, they lost their luster as time went on. Still, stepping into a magically cordoned off jail to fight what I can only assume is meant to entrap the most evil, dangerous souls of the land between is a pretty neat concept. You're on their turf, fighting them on their terms, so winning tastes all the sweeter. The Hero of Zamor has a clean, fair moveset, elegant like the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, but slow, predictable, not all charge and trigger happy rampage like majority of the game's bosses. It's a fine introduction, and other than perhaps the initial Leonine Misbegotten and Bloodhound, this ranked among my top early game bosses. The Crucible Knight was a different beast. Slow, ponderous, but all the more deadly since he's rock solid, cannot be interrupted, and has an impenetrable defense. The armor design is amazing, harking back to a time when plated knights roamed the world instead of the scraps we find of Godrick's forces. I think it's a shame that there was limited variety in the Crucible Knights, that most were just copied and pasted, because this easily could have rivaled the Black Knights in Dark Souls if each Crucible Knight was part of a squad, had a different weapon you could collect. Greatsword, axe, halberd, spear, etc. It felt like a missed opportunity to fight the same Evergaol variant again and again. This one though, the first one, haunting the Stormveil Evergaol, I wouldn't actually beat until much later into the game, since my attempts at parrying the bastard were falling short. The Evergaol experience wasn't entirely soured by later repetition, however. The one I found in Leonia of the Lakes was an absolute laugh. Here I was, nervous about stepping into this arena after getting whooped so many times in Stormveil, nervous about what monstrosity might be lurking in this abyss, when out pops this fat little fire-breathing midget. I don't know what his deal is. I don't even care if there's a backstory to this dude. He was just so funny and a caricature, and I was cautious and bewildered, worried there might be a second phase, or maybe his damage output would scale really high, like there'll be some trick to this, but no, he's easy to dodge and died in 3 or 4 swings of the greatsword. There's a lot of fun here, across all of the Evergaols, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Another regular boss is the Knight's Cavalry. Only appearing at night, these knights are reminiscent of the Dullahan from Irish folklore. Black clothing, black steed, shrouded in dark intentions. These actually do a better job than the Crucible Knights of scratching that Black Knight itch I have from Dark Souls, as these often have different weapons and, due to the nighttime appearances, carry with them an atmosphere of mingling dread and excitement. The footage here is from some ways into the mid-game, but plenty of these scatter the early game zones, meaning once you stumble into each other, the fight is on. Mechanically, you can have a crack at horseback or on foot, and both have their merits, but the more confident players will probably have an easier time on foot since you're not spending 10 minutes circling around each other like dogs chasing their tails. So once again, we have a decently fun encounter that maybe runs a little stale into the late game, but the nighttime mechanic injects a decent amount of replayability, since surely I didn't encounter them all, fight every single one, purely because of the timing of my journey. Importantly, it affirms that the world is dangerous, that you should fear the night, that as long as you struggle forward, you will always be at risk. But the crown of my early game encounter goes to this handsome article right here. Now, early is subjective, since you may not have gotten to the Ancestor Spirit until later, but I arrived here after only a few hours gameplay and was mesmerized. The arena and music, the particle effects, and the boss's moveset, all of it is stunning. Walking into the beast's cavern and catching its distant silhouette wrapped in shimmering blue mist feels like trespassing on something spiritual, like an act of sacrilege. You're not meant to be here. You've come out of your way to interrupt this primordial creature's grazings, and from that note onward, the fight feels a little mournful. It's not especially hard, but if you do it at a low level, some patience will be required to really count out the seconds before its attacks are unleashed. Antlers scraping the floor and exploding upward, breathing spiritual flames and walking back over them to create distance from you, prancing on thin air and slamming into the ground. The fact that so much of its moveset is defensive or neutral, separating itself from you, creating space, inviting you into error rather than attempting to kill you with an explosion, doubly affirms to me that this is a peaceful creature. The sound design is also sensational. The small chimes and sprinkles of the magic to the quiet, questioning music, layered with bestial noises, what sound like hyena laughter and animal grunts. Genuinely, this is one of my favorite franchise fights ever. The atmosphere was delightful and such a surprise that in my early game, I loved it so much that I was a little disappointed to find the fight was repeated later on. Just why? Why rehash this beautiful, unique experience? Why taint it with repetition, even if the second fight had a few extra moves and added difficulty? That all could have been packaged and rolled into this first encounter, and the later part of the game would have lost nothing from excluding it. But once again, Elden Ring has to diminish a good thing by stuffing in content. I like that this is an optional fight. Again, since it's not mandatory, slaying this creature feels like you're destroying something precious purely so nobody can enjoy it after you. There isn't immense lore significance or story context that I'm aware of, and that works in the encounter's favour. Lighting the fires to arrive here was a surprise. To kill the creature feels selfish and wrong, and that contributes to making the fight so memorable. Beating the Ancestor Spirit, however, changed the game for me, because picking up the Ancestor Guardian's Spirit Ashes, I now had my standard summon that I would use for the rest of the game, who you'll see accompany me in many of the upcoming clips. With my trusty Spirit Ashes and a few more levels under my belt, it was time to return to Limgrave and Margit, who had whooped me bad at level 15, but now, at level 40 and with an upgraded axe, I was feeling pretty confident. Margit is the first real story encounter of the game. There have been other whole videos dedicated to analysing him as a skill check and how his sweeping attacks, the narrow arena, and his fluctuating intensity of aggression make for a difficult early game boss fight. That's probably all true. He's the first boss, first character, who has you wondering about the world. We're in Stormvale Castle hunting down Godrick the Grafted, a real villainous prick. So the assumption at this stage of the game is that Margit is his servant, his hunchbacked butler, but who is now here to check your foolish ambitions before you can reach the castle interior. The ramparts we fight on and the castle in the distance all seem formidable and maintained, as in they're not dilapidated or ruinous, so people still live and work here, and Margit, with his big nose and bigger stick, is fitting into that. Except he doesn't, actually. We later learn he's a child of Marika, the world's living goddess, and he himself is ruler of Liandel, the faraway capital, so the fact he's here becomes a bit of a question mark that's never tightly answered. While the later reveal of him in Liandel is neat, it surprised me, and I wonder if we might have benefited from a character here more connected to Godrick the Grafted, an appetizer that created a sense of narrative leading to the dreaded fight with Godrick, maybe one of his horrific creations that he had engineered to patrol the battlements. But this here, fighting Margit and later Godrick, is a taste of a trend in the game's main boss encounters going forward for each legacy dungeon. One smaller encounter, followed by the big showcase lore important battle. But as will be seen with all the demigod fights, From Software never seems to insert a relevant story-driven first fight. It's almost always a throwaway, copy and paste Crucible Knight or something else we've fought before. Here in Stormveil, there's 2 unique encounters, but facing Margit, who's interesting and well designed, didn't actually enhance the story, the build up, the dread of Godrick the Grafted. It raised questions, added some mysticism to the world, but I don't know, it feels a little off to me, like we're missing backstory and context, and I'd be interested to know what you think if you found the first fights in Legacy Dungeons, purely from a story perspective, a bit of a letdown. Margit is a good fight, and he's fun, and he's challenging, but why couldn't we have somebody more connected to Godrick? The journey through Stormveil Castle is grey, moody, and full of scrapes with undeath and decay. You're back in the Undead Burg, and to clear the castle, we have to face the fallen monarch Godrick the Grafted. In hindsight, Godrick is an early game boss, not even a demigod, but rather a pretender who has no impact on the story. He only drops 10 or 20,000 souls, pennies compared to the motherloads you'll find by the game's end. But ignoring his disconnect from Margit, Godrick might just be the best telegraphed antagonist personality of the game. All throughout Limgrave we hear horror-stricken stories of Godrick the Grafted. We see crucified, mutilated bodies and the remnants of his tattered forces. His name is said in conspiratorial whispers. I said earlier that George R.R. Martin's presence isn't felt anywhere in the game, that Elden Ring does represent itself just like any other From Software title in story and aesthetic, but the sense of continuity in narrative, the entire context and progression towards Godrick does feel like it has an author's polish. So if Martin had his thumb anywhere, I have to wonder if it was here. Godrick is truly horrendous, less than human, sewn together by who knows how many corpses and how many species. The fight is fun. Godrick and his great axes are aggressive and wild and flailing, almost as if his personality and strategy is torn and distracted by the many souls that inhabit his flesh. True to his name, he grafts himself midway through the fight with a bloody dragon, now gaining an on-command flamethrower that you better damn well roll away from. Godrick was honestly a treat. It was a fun fight, but like Radahn later on, it was only the hours of context before facing him, the genuine horror and fear by Limgrave's denizens, the weight of his reputation that preceded him, that made him feel like a genuinely classic encounter. Let's turn to Caelid for a while. A tortured, brutalized landscape tinted red by the scarlet rot. Visually and mechanically, it's my favorite experience in the game just because of how tense and horrible it is. Such commitment to a hellish atmosphere makes for a great time. In one of the dungeons, I had my first run-in with the Magma Wyrm. Now, you fight a lot of these things throughout the game, too many for my liking, and this was probably the worst possible introduction to that overgrown lizard, or stunted dragon, whichever it is. Its moveset is about thrashing, pouring magma, and stomping around so that you have to chase it down. A fine moveset, but awful when slapped into a cramped cave. It gets stuck, and you get stuck, and there isn't any room to circle around it, and I found using Spirit Ashes an active hindrance, since it made the spread of lava all the worse. But that Magma Wyrm was a relaxed brunch compared to my first tussle with the Falling Star Beast, a gravity bull, onyx black and magically enhanced so that it can float you to the ceiling and crash you back down to earth if you don't jump its attack. What a fantastic, cool idea. But again, absolute rubbish while cramped into a tiny cave arena. And this is a trend for a lot of bosses in Elden Ring. Really interesting and engaging in the open world or native arena, but awful when put into one of these silly little dungeons beneath the ground. And in my view, the Falling Star Beast in particular should never have been repeated, because your later encounter with it near the volcano is phenomenal. I don't have the recording, but in that fight you're on horseback, spring upward to a mountaintop crater, and you're surprised by the fight, suddenly starting, but no matter, you're outside, you've got your horse in an open arena with the fumes and the castle and the lava behind you. With patience you take it down in what is a memorable surprise encounter, but copying and pasting the same boss into this dingy cave and later to the outskirts of Liandel makes me wonder if this shit was ever playtested, because it's really lame and it really detracts from the experience. But Caelid is the giver of gifts, and sometimes janky encounters can be a good thing because it allows you to get creative. In the middle of Caelid is an awful swamp of scarlet rot mired in thick mist and home to unpleasant creatures. Lore-wise, I assume this is the epicenter of the scarlet rot nuclear bomb unleashed by Melania against Radahn. That this is where they fought and where Caelid's corruption stems from. but you're safe on horseback. While aimlessly exploring, imagine my surprise when a boss fight suddenly begins. A titan of a man who shakes his flag and summons soldiers to his aid, crossbowmen and melee warriors, and if you don't take them out, he'll be buffing them. And once you get him to half health, he summons them back for another round. I love the idea of this fight. Commander O'Neill, a loyal military man who lost his mind and bearings long ago, still holds the standard for General Radahn, and troops still respond to his call even in undeath. A much more lackluster version of this fight appears in the endgame against Commander Niall, a necessary encounter if you want to unlock the Frozen Wastes and the Haligtree, both optional areas. That the fight takes place in a restricted courtyard and only 2 knights, strong knights but only ever 2, are summoned. The fight therefore focuses more on the less interesting Niall himself, rather than the more novel mechanic of the rush to take out the summons before they become too buffed and become out of reach. No, in my opinion, Commander O'Neill in Caelid is the far superior encounter. Since it's outdoors, you can swing by on horseback or grapple toe to toe with the summons on foot. The options are there. But I kept failing against O'Neill himself. He was too sturdy and I was too impatient to wait out his moves. But what I noticed was that he follows you around the arena and even outside the arena. And what's outside the arena but great geysers of scarlet rot, powerful jets of poison that damage anybody who walks through them. Well, if there's one thing I'll never do, it's pass up an easy opportunity to cheese a boss. I loved that this worked, luring the boss into a natural hazard of the environment. And I love even more that it's possibly intentional, because I later read online that plenty of people were doing this as well. It's not honourable and it's not befitting a man of O'Neill's standing to be fooled and shamed like this. But in this game, it doesn't matter how you win, it just matters that you did. Sometimes winning though doesn't require trickery or any effort really. I was enjoying the build up to the Sealer Twins fight because after spending half an hour in the sorcerer town of Sealer, lighting braziers and dodging Viet Cong tactics from invisible spellcasters, I was excited to step through the doors to find a double boss fight, both wielding different weapons, having different fighting tactics. But I don't know what this was meant to be. It was a slaughter. If the idea was to give the player a power trip by allowing you to ride your horse, fling the bosses into the air and knock them from wall to wall since their poise was so low, then mission success. It certainly didn't feel like a climax to an interesting zone, but rather a little speed bump that I'd honestly forgotten about until I reviewed my footage. I couldn't tell you if these were lore relevant characters or had a story to them because they were there and then in an instant they were gone. But winning became difficult as I entered Castle Redmont, Caelid's citadel, and hit my first hard barrier. By this time I'd been using my greatsword for a great deal of time, a powerful weapon taking entire chunks out of powerful enemies' health bars, with the caveat that each swing would take 2 to 3 business days to land. A greatsword is slow, it is very slow. Often that doesn't matter once you've started swinging, but sometimes it was a major hurdle. And boy, it was a hurdle in that double fight against the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten. I really hated this fight. I was stuck here and had to leave it for a while, but this is the only one that left a sour taste in my mouth because the fight is just dumb. This isn't Ornstein and Smaug, or even the multiple gargoyles fight, where dual bosses are designed in consideration of each other, giving you a fair edge if you could focus on one, exploit its weakness, and pick it apart while dodging the other boss. No, here you have the Misbegotten, who is an aggressive turd, paired with the Crucible Knight, a relentless turd. These bosses do not go together. You can't fight them together. Not as an all melee build at least, which leaves you one choice. The Misbegotten spawns maybe 10 seconds earlier, so you gotta nuke the bastard. You have to obliterate him, destroy him so fast that by the time the Crucible Knight spawns, it's a one-on-one. This solution isn't an awful design choice, but it's unreliable, and it's an annoying gamble you need to pass in order to progress to the actual fight and skill check, being the duel against the Crucible Knight. So I had to swap out the greatsword for a hammer, something that hit a little quicker, and get to hitting these two. I think what I found most disappointing is what I explained earlier, that the prelude to the zone's major bosses tend to be a letdown in Elden Ring. Radahn is one of the more interesting lore characters, boss fights, and imprints on the history of the lands between. His effect is everywhere, and he's a narrative force to be reckoned with. Someone who stops the stars, unleashes meteors, and tears holes into the earth for you to later explore. So the fact that the prelude to his fight, in his encounter in Castle Redmont, his own castle, isn't, for example, the sorcerer who taught him gravity magic, or maybe one of his lovers or his greatest warrior, or anything else that is more personal to him. And that's disappointing. Doubly so because later the scenes ahead in the feast were compelling and fun. No, it's just another bloody Misbegotten and Crucible night. As I've said again and again, the build up to Radahn's fight is phenomenal. Throughout our journey, we've been hearing NPCs talk ominously, reverently about a feast, a great clash of arms, with many participants. Later, once we've cleared Castle Redmont, we see everyone gathered as we prepare to journey to fight Radahn in a battle royale. Awesome setup. But the thing is, I've played enough of these games to know that these types of gladiatorial settings, while cool in theory, normally turn out half-baked and pretty underwhelming, that the code normally breaks and the NPCs won't run into the fight, that it lacks drama because of stilted animations and janky combat and even more janky AI. But I should have had more faith. Teleporting into the arena, you find Radahn perched on the hilltop, his great bow already flexing back as he prepares to snipe you. You'll probably be caught off guard on your first entrance and cop a great arrow to the face, but on repeat runs the process is clear. Roll his arrows, hide behind dunes and barricades, and sprint away from the arrow hailstorms, all while summoning your assistants, including Blade, Patches, Alexander, characters well known to you, friends. More than any other fight, it's here you feel like you're challenging a demigod. Radahn is bloated with power, his horse almost crushed beneath his behemoth weight as he zips around the battlefield, his dual blades cutting and sweeping arcs through everyone and everything. Funnily enough, he's easiest to fight on foot as his overmobility actually works against him, allowing you to roll nicely, wait for him to pass overhead and cut at the legs. And then you get him to health and, oh man, easily the coolest transition I've ever seen in a boss fight. A literal comet hurtling onto the battlefield, the sky darkening with his arrival. Starscourge Radahn earned his moniker. But tackling the second phase felt a little dumb to my melee build. The footage is pre-nerf and I gave this fight a number of cracks, learning his moveset and swings, but no matter my strategy, I just seemed to get railed by his comets and gravity magic. So, accepting that I am in fact a coward, I purchased and upgraded a bow and maxed out the bleed damage and cheesed the rest of the fight. But even this experience was pretty fun, chipping away, running for my life if ever his aggression switched to me, the delicate art of continually reviving allies without attracting his comets, and the dopamine hit of seeing a bleed proc. Radahn was ultimately a spectacle, a handful of chosen warriors against a demigod amongst red dunes and a field of swords. It was evocative and in my opinion earns its spot as a gimmick fight done to perfection. My only disappointment is that this beach, endless red dunes adjacent to the silhouette of the castle, the sprawling beach that occupies a third of Caelid, the mystifying stretch of land I had my eyes on from the moment I unlocked the Caelid map fragment, is entirely limited to this fight. Now, it's a cool boss arena, absolutely, but this environment is so cool and unique that when I first spied it from a distance, I spent a good hour trying to get down here from the Caelid cliffside, to later realize it was only a boss arena, only accessible through the castle. No other relevance beyond the Radahn fight was a little disappointing. But the concept, the execution, the beautiful chaos, the meteor entry in the second half, and the sheer difficulty doing this fight at a low level, I adored everything packaged here. The next shard bearer on our slaughter fiesta was Renalla. Progressing through her sorcery academy was an enjoyable journey through blue-tinted mists, book-laden corridors, and fortress-like courtyards, capped off with a peculiar fight and an even more peculiar cutscene. Hundreds of Renallas crawling on the floor, no words, just appealing eyes and laughter. Then there's one grabbing you, others reaching out to you, all of them in fact, so eager, like gleeful children. Just what the hell is this? It's so weird, so delightful and unnerving. It could only have been developed by From Software. It captures well the atmosphere and lore behind Renalla, being a supremely powerful woman who had it all but was then shattered by heartbreak and regressed into herself, losing her brilliance and sanity until she was left as, well, whatever the hell she is now. The encounter is a fun set piece, but stupidly easy for anyone who's been maxing strength and carries a big sword. The first half is an iteration that From Software has been honing since Dark Souls 2, that I thought it had pretty much nailed in 3 with the Deacons of the Deep fight. You run amongst the Renallas, dodging projectile books, flamethrowers, and other hazards of the room, cutting them down to no avail until you find the one marked with a golden hue, and only after knocking out several will she fall down from her floating haven to grant you the opportunity to assail the helpless demigoddess. It's an easy process of rinse and repeat until the next phase, which suggests to me more hazards could have been used here to ramp up the tension, maybe summons or area of effect damage that could have been used to avoid and trigger more action from you. Now, the second phase, truthfully, I'm not sure how difficult the second phase is meant to be. I died once by face tanking a laser, but had no real trouble with her summons. The second time, well, this happened. Apparently Renalla can summon dragons and giants. Apparently Renalla poses a hard barrier to some builds, like how the pre-Radahn fight was to me. Apparently there's complexity here. I couldn't say. So Renalla is squishy and dies quickly to a big sword. I will never hold that against someone, not even a demigoddess. It was disappointing, but a refreshing change after my slog with Radahn. What I will say is that the transition into the second arena is gorgeous. Backed by a full moon and atop a still lake, you battle this grief-stricken sorceress. Given that context, and knowing her emotional vulnerability, I don't even mind that people have mixed results with her difficulty. In fact, it seems kind of fitting, an acknowledgement that mental harm hits folk to different results. Visually, it's gorgeous and memorable. In terms of supporting her lore, I think it ties in nicely. It was hard to leave Renalla, and indeed the whole academy, without a positive impression. But for a completely different change of pace, we have Praetor Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, the final cursed sibling who needs little introduction given he's been memed to death these past 6 months.
Together we will devour the very god.
Again, like the other demigods, we have a gimmick fight reminiscent of Wyrm the Giant from Dark Souls 3, but actually done quite well this time. Essentially, this twisted, sacrilegious giant serpent is nearly invulnerable unless you use the aptly named Serpent Hunter, conveniently placed at the fight's entrance. I enjoyed the mystery of the first half of the fight. It's clear that Rykard, the area's named demigod, will be the second half of the fight, but part of me didn't expect him to have evolved into a serpent himself. Rather, after beating the god-devouring serpent, I expected the serpent to perhaps vomit him up, or for him to waltz into the arena, but no, he's one with the serpent, whatever is left of his humanity emblazoned onto the underneath of the serpent's head, a Voldemort to Professor Quirrell. The second half runs similar to the first, except that all hell now rains down. Fire and brimstone beneath a maddening crimson sky, an apocalypse given delicious visual form. Again, From Software nails the feeling of fighting a creature so far out of your league it feels foolish to even make the attempt, but in reality the challenge is quite mild. The Serpent Hunter can stunlock Rykard, so you can just wail on the poor snake, dodging the occasional projectile until the fight is done. It's an okay fight. In terms of lore, I was never grabbed or inspired by Rykard, his blasphemy and eagerness to become a serpent, like I was by Renalla and Radahn, but still, it was a fun showpiece, and I think most people will have a decent time with Rykard. Progressing through Liandel, you finally reach the heart of the Erd Tree, after slogging through tens of hours of content to finally ascend that staircase to the center of civilization where we can see the man-made stone jutting from and merging into the magical world of the Erd Tree. It's truly surreal the first time you experience it. Then, the surprise. Margit, now revealed as Morgott, the disfigured son of Marika, greets us, condemning the Shardbearers and all their petty rivalries. It's he who stands in the way of our quest, he who denies the path forward, his iconic staff exploding to reveal a deadly saber beneath. Very anime, but admittedly pretty cool. At Stormveil he was holding back on tutorial mode, but here we see what the demigod is capable of. It's a large arena, minimalistic as far as throne rooms go, but also ornate, tasteful. Morgott's sincere contempt is powerful and a fun contrast to our own wanderlust. His anger, the sheer aggression of his moveset versus our confusion and vulnerability, as I at least wondered if this fight would be another hard block, a barrier to players reaching the endgame. Except, and I think this will be an experience shared by many people, I was so over leveled by this point, well over level 100, and it didn't matter how hard Morgott hit, how long his attacks chained together, how often he jumped around. I don't even think I summoned Spirit Ashes, I just weathered the attacks, dodged if it felt essential, kept chugging my Estus Flask, and just smacked him with my big old swords. I like the intention behind Morgott, and the narrative weight was palpable. This felt like a big deal, that he was revealed as Liandor's secret king, the lord to a vacant throne. Yes, it does feel like a big deal, but the curse of the open world genre will always unveil itself towards the mid to late game, that if you engage with enough dungeons, that if you do enough of the side content, the story bosses become a cakewalk. Morgott could have been a big deal, he could have been a hard block, he could have been a mechanical challenge, and he may have even been interesting in terms of lore, but he's defeated so easily, he's brushed aside, that unfortunately his presence doesn't stick. Once we set the Erd Tree ablaze, we're transported to Farum Azula. Again, I was struggling with burnout by this stage, so it's hard to say how much of my dislike for this zone was genuine. That said, Dark Souls has taken us to forests, lakes, snowy mountains, poison swamps, and magma wastelands, so a torn up Tornado Valley is a genuinely unique biome that sticks out. Problem is, there are 2 boss fights here, both unique, but the mandatory one sucks balls. I get it, the lore concept of this creature protecting destined death, true death, and that for us to take on Marika, a real deity, we need to defeat this creature and wrench death from its stubborn paws. I get it, I'm all there, but the fight just sucks. The fight against the clergy beastman is fine enough. He's aggressive, quick, his shabby robes concealing his dangerous movements as daggers and knives and even boulders are flung forward. It's a repeat of the beastman clergy you might have already fought in Caelid, but overall it's enjoyable. Moves you can react to, a push and pull, a sense of fairness, and in a just world that would have been the sum of the fight. Unfortunately, phase 2 comes around. Maliketh, the Black Blade, collects all the small quirks I've tolerated from Elden Ring and mushes them together into a sickly paste that stinks of bullshit. The combos are long and erratic, holding to bait out your roll and then releasing a flurry of strikes, bouncing between pillars in the room, sometimes spending half a minute flying around, unable to be touched by a melee, but God forbid he clips you and takes out your entire health bar. He's more like a Smash Brothers character than anything from Soulsborne. His cartoonish sword and sleek armor with gravity-defying moves that just keeps bouncing him skyward. Yes, I'll admit it is a compelling design. The arena feels ancient, the black on gold is beautiful, and the crimson shading to the lacquer black spells and trail of his sword swings harkens to a Final Fantasy or Dragon Ball Z character. I'll concede it's gorgeous, but I hated engaging with it. I didn't want to learn the fight, it felt rubbish, whether he was clipping between the pillars or wailing on you for a minute straight or making unpredictable moves, none of it just felt fun. Any hit I landed felt like a fluke, and the dozens he'd land on me eroded my patience. An interesting idea, a unique design, but I'll be damned if I wasn't glad to be finally rid of this painful encounter. But hey, that's what the Mimic tier is for. It's strange that for the next 2 bosses, probably the most important and actively foreshadowed and intersecting with the rest of the story, are entirely optional and tucked into corners of the endgame. Mohg, the Lord of Blood, is found through a quaint little portal at the edge of an icy wasteland you may easily miss. The portal leads you back beneath the world to these blood-infused swamps, with the Lord of Blood found atop his Acropolis-like structure. Mohg is brother to Morgott and son to Marika, making him one of those weird troll monsters, and he's stolen Miquella, one of the few demigods you don't actually whoop throughout your playthrough. Mohg is shrouded in mystery, and other than his infatuations with Miquella and his disdain for the established order, I struggled to pin his character archetype, but what does that matter when, after Radahn, he has one of the more memorable mid-fight transitions. The Lord of Blood is true to his namesake. Beneath a crystal-studded ceiling, he wears the wings of a corrupted angel and fights with blood and fire. I'm not sure if there's a way to survive his transition other than healing through it, so relentless is his spell work and damage. So in these Greek-inspired ruins, wearing a Medusa-like helm and fighting with a trident, you challenge and kill this demigod. Not because you have to, but because he's there. If you made it this far into Elden Ring, I doubt he'll be much trouble. No, it's the other optional climax that may just cost your sanity. Melania is found at the roots of the Halig tree, a bastardized tree that's rotted and darkened, a hollow spectre compared to the incandescent glory of the real trees that dot the lands between. I was fascinated by Melania from the story's outset, from the initial trailer from years back where we see her confronting Radahn herself, a red-headed, one-armed woman against a behemoth demigod. My interest only grew as I explored Caelid, knowing that she was the source of the scarlet rot that ruined the land, that she was the one who ultimately infected and doomed Radahn to forever wander that wasteland beachside a wreck, a hollow man. A horrendous victory in retrospect. But Melania is more famous for kicking the shit out of every player who ever attempts her. Even trying to play the game blind, I couldn't help but be spoiled for how difficult this encounter was, how game-breaking and unfair. She's the zenith of challenge in Elden Ring, and a real pain in the ass. Is it possible to make an Elden Ring video without whinging about this fight? Not for me, it isn't. Her gimmick is that her sword strikes recover health, lifesteal essentially, except it's more than just stealing your hit points. If she hits any of your summons, her health will recover. If she hits your shield, her health will recover. I'm pretty salty about that last one because being what I thought was a clever ploy, and for the first and only time in my playthrough, I picked up a heavy shield and maxed it out thinking that would nullify her feeling, all the way to plus 25 before testing my hypothesis. Nope, that lady can heal through granite and I just wasted a lot of somber stones. But even then, the lifesteal wouldn't be a problem if she wasn't a frenzied expert duelist. With less than 40 vitality, you can expect her slashing combos, or in her second phase, the Scarlet Rot Bomb, to one-shot you always. If you're prone to error as I am, you need vitality. So she's hard, unfairly so, but only if you're trying to go toe-to-toe to play into her game of trading blows and letting her heal. But for a player as untempered as me, that wouldn't work. No, you have to. You must use the resources the game throws at you. She can be interrupted, so you have to interrupt her. She's vulnerable to bleed and freeze, so you better use those. Melania is the height of challenge, but also the game's measuring stick for how much you can break its systems, how dramatically you can min-max, how intensely you can cheese in a vacuum. Me? I stole a build from Reddit and tried my hardest to stun lock the demon. It took a few tries and typically my summon died while still at a third health, leaving me with the palm sweating task of finishing the job myself. In terms of lore and narrative weight, it's hard to pin Melania. We've probably spent by this point hours of hearing Gideon Ofnir talking about her, building her up, hyping her, and we knew what she did to Caelid, so there is a genuine sense of dread and narrative weight when coming to her, confronting her. But meeting her, we also get the sense that this is a tortured woman, a wounded woman. She is deeply in love and protective of her brother Miquella, so to fight her, to challenge her on her own turf, similar to the Ancestor Beast, feels like we're doing something wrong, that we're putting down a wounded dog, that there's no need for this. But because she's there, we take the challenge. More so than Melania as a boss fight, it's interesting to see how her story interacts with Militison. The whole Militison questline feels like you're dealing with an after-image of Melania. You're dealing with a one-armed, red-headed woman who herself is corroding to and falling to the scarlet rot. It's a long journey, and Militison herself chooses to let the scarlet rot consume her, possibly because she doesn't want to become the demon, the goddess of scarlet rot that Melania does. She takes the active decision to end herself rather than succumbing to what it is that has taken Melania. Knowing that Militison made that decision, and knowing that the scarlet rot does seem inevitable, interminable, there's no cure for it. It kills demigods, it destroys entire landscapes. Knowing all that, fighting and defeating Melania therefore can be seen to be an act of service. She's losing a duel to a warrior she acknowledges at the end who exceeds her and her own expectations, releasing her from the ravaging horrors of the scarlet rot. Melania is controversial, and that's why she's optional, why she's a temptation. I hope that, by beating her, we'd get more interesting story implications and developments than what we did, but as a final cliffhanger before tying out the game, she certainly earns her place in From Software's catalogue of fame and infamy. Gideon Ofnir, we always knew we would face him, even from the early hours of the game where the unfolding story was still so murky. He was expressly clear. He was seeking to become an Elden Lord. There could only be one. The alliance we struck, him providing board at the hall, us providing knowledge, could never last, so it was inevitable that returning to the throne we would encounter him. I like how straight this is played. He was never our friend, so there's no feeling of betrayal, just a terminated business arrangement. The only tinge of disappointment comes from Gideon's turn in opinion, his sudden skepticism, his newfound belief that a Tarnished can't become an Elden Lord. From a later item description of his armor, we learn he finally glimpsed the knowledge of Marika, that he knows that she's all that keeps the Elden Beast at bay, and that terrified him. At the final hurdle, he lost his nerve and now blocks our path, believing neither he nor we are worthy, are capable of seeing the task through. Well, it's not hard to set him straight. He's a strong NPC, but his over-reliance on magic leaves him rather vulnerable, but you can't get cocky. Gideon has a strong arsenal, and there are times where you have to play defensive. I tried to make use of my crossbow, but couldn't make favourable trades, so I did my usual greatsword swings to catch him in a stun lock. I like that he was a sorcerer, as opposed to melee. I like that there's a subtle character arc, a change to his beliefs and motives. It's quiet and understated, so good job From Software. This was a nice appetizer before the main course. Earlier I said my joy with Godrick and Radahn, even Gideon Ofnir to an extent, came from the context, the build-up, the palpable tension as fate drew you to these encounters. Well, for an entire reversal on that trend, here comes Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. Godfrey was Marika's first husband until he ran out of kingdoms to conquer and got the boot. That means he's Morgott's father, and he even has a tender little moment mourning that acne-ridden troll's corpse that I forgot to record. But Godfrey has been gone for a long time, so in the arc of the story he only appears now to play spoiler. Seeing the way to the Erd Tree is open, he's returned with no forewarning to yonk it out from us to reclaim his title as Elden Lord. There's two interesting things to note. Firstly, I've said that my biggest gripe of the game has been the overuse of certain assets, particularly boss fights, that erode the novelty and narrative weight, but Godfrey might just be one of the few exceptions. Hours, tens of hours earlier, we fought him, a golden spectre haunting a random atrium, no fanfare or cutscenes, just a discreet prelude fight to make his presence known. To see him again begets a single question in the player's mind: how much more of a challenge is Godfrey in the flesh? Second is his politeness in addressing us. In his cutscene, Godfrey refers to us as brave tarnished. Look, I'm no simp, but after 100 hours of being called foul tarnished, maidenless, misguided, and all manner of stupid, there's a surprising rapport built just from him being polite, acknowledging us as cut from the same cloth, admiring the journey we've taken, one he's intimately familiar with. So we face an Elden Lord, a true Elden Lord, not an aspirer like us or a coward like Gideon. And it's fantastic. In this fight, probably 100 hours too late, it occurred to me I can use the jump trigger to leap over shockwave attacks, use verticality to dodge his stomps. I don't know why I wasn't doing it earlier, but it made for some cinematic exchanges. Godfrey is as he looks, powerful, skillful, relentless, a warrior king, but his second phase is where things get crazy. I don't know if the bonding with his spiritual cat hugging his shoulder is ever fleshed out in great detail. My understanding is he's bottled part of himself within the creature, his animalism and barbarism, so as to better fit in with Marika and her golden society, but facing us and being pushed to breaking point, he claims it back. He kills his kitty and reassumes his absent animalism, his true nature from centuries past, HOARAH LOUUUX. From here on, he fights like a wild man, dropping the range of his axe for punches, kicks, and WrestleMania pile drivers. It's a unique and memorable and surprisingly fair fight, but for the life of me, I don't know why he wasn't given more hit points. This should have been a whole new health bar, but instead, he was only a few swings from death after the cutscene. Maybe this is thematically appropriate. He's stripped off his armor and is fighting without care for his safety, attempting an all-in last-ditched effort, so maybe it's intentional, but he had a cool moveset and the party was over in minutes for me. What a shame. I resent the fact I didn't spend long with Godfrey. Unlike Melania or Radahn, the first Elden Lord didn't stick around long enough to express himself, to communicate his spirit and personality as well as he might had he killed me a few times and forced me to learn and engage with his moveset, to engage in the combat dance a while longer. Unlike Gideon, he didn't play much of a role in my story prior to this moment. So it's not like I had a history of interaction and building tension that meant that even a short fight could feel conclusive. No, like a bad shonen anime, this compelling character appeared on screen, spat a few cool one-liners, then got whooped by an idiot with 2 big swords and disappeared from relevance. I understand it. If Gideon was an appetizer, then Godfrey is the entree, a little meze platter to enjoy before the main course. I understand, but it was delightful and I would have liked more. Radagon and the Elden Beast form the final canon narrative boss fight in the game. By entering the Erdtree, you are confronting the deity and pillar of the world order, Marika, or her alter ego, Radagon. Without question, Marika is the most name-dropped character in the whole game, from churches to respawn stakes to NPC musings, so even if you've half-heartedly followed the story, seeing the cutscene of a woman hovering in the air, crucified posture, you appreciate its significance. After you take out Radagon, this is followed by a less impressive, less immersive brawl against an alien parasite looking worm that is the true source of power and mystique in this world, the Elden Beast, the avatar of the Outer Will. I found the Radagon fight more compelling. Lore-wise, confronting Marika felt inevitable, predestined, whereas ideas about the Outer Will and gods lurking in the cosmos were interesting but murky. Radagon also feels epic. The title screen music plays a heroic swell that builds and builds so that if you fail, you immediately want back in, like you're begging your coach to throw you back in the fight. Again and again, you want to butt your head against Radagon, because Radagon might kick your butt for a while. Elden Ring is a game that, if nothing else, offers you choice, overwhelming choice. From build to gear to summons and spirit ashes, you'll notice I often play with my trusty companion the ancestral follower ashes. Partly because I love the Ancestor Beast fight so dearly, this summon was like a souvenir, and partly because I thought it was a powerful ally, melee in range, pretty staunch and difficult to put down. Later in the game, as certain endgame bosses ground me down, I'd take the easier route with my Mimic tier. But Spirit Ashes could be forgotten because I wanted Radagon for myself. I wanted the one-on-one, the duel, the test of wills. Not because I'm a good player. The fact is I was so over-leveled that I had long forgotten how to play conservatively and with finesse and calculation. No, I had a massive health bar and 20 Estus flasks, and I was damn well going to use them. But even then, it still felt thematically, narratively appropriate to fight Radagon alone. To kill a living god and tear down the world order is a personal, selfish decision, so it felt right to take the plunge alone. Radagon is bathed in holy light and wields a hammer, the same used to forge the Elden Ring, I presume, now used to smack us around. It's hard to keep distance since his leaps can cover the entire arena and his ranged holy lances are lightning quick. If you're running, if you're on the back foot, you'll be punished. Radagon is only one phase of the fight, but there's clever difficulty design in his makeup, in that the closer to death he is, the more relentless and aggressive he becomes. By the 3/4 mark, it is a non-stop barrage of holy lances, explosions, wild swings, leaps and grabs. It's desperate and stressful, and if you're not careful, all your resources will be worn away by attrition before you reach the next stage. Like Godfrey, you can leap his attacks, sometimes, but my favourite move is easily when he snatches you and beats you like a frickin' anvil, like he can rebuild the Elden Ring from caving in your chest and splattering your corpse. More than anything, the atmosphere is triumphant. The opening music is crescendoing and you feel like an adventurer doing the right thing, a clash of ideals as you forge ahead to change the world and free it from stagnation. This is a strong contrast to the following Elden Beast fight, where the music is lighter, otherworldly, a bit more stilted, questioning, wondering at the curiosity of the Elden Beast and the Outer Will and what it all means. As a fight, I found the Elden Beast pretty uninspiring. A few interesting mechanics of jumping over the halos of light and predictable sword swing patterns that were a welcome change, but it's a massive arena and the boss regularly teleports across, and it would benefit from horse riding, and compared to the controlled chaos and sense of accomplishment in the Radagon fight, this feels very subdued, quiet, dull. I appreciate that's a purposeful choice, one of artistic merit as we're supposed to ponder the outer wheel, but I disagree with that choice. Radagon is the real challenge, and if you reach the Elden Beast with enough resources, then it's not too much of a challenge to murder the alien parasite and finish the game. At this point, the player character has killed enough demigods and shaken the order of the lands between that the future is now free to be determined. The different endings are largely dependent on which NPC questlines you follow through and how sadistic you want to be. Me? I was in Ranni's pocket from start to finish, and I found her questline to be surprisingly sophisticated by From Software standards. It's just so typical that after 100 hours and 2 months of investment, I of course would choose the one ending that doesn't result in my character becoming an Elden Lord. Elden Ring is a good game. I've spent a lot of this video trashing it, lamenting the repeated bosses, the lack of thematic vision, or environmental storytelling in some places which I loved so dearly in Dark Souls. Elden Ring is a good game. I just wish that its lore, world building, and subtle features were more interesting to me. Maybe they are to you, but to me they're not, and that's fine, because Elden Ring is still a good game. My 100 hours spent banging my head through its world is proof of that. It could have been leaner and more aspirational in some of its boss fights, yes, but there's no denying that it takes a steaming dump on the open world games of years past. Assassin's Creed and other collectathon clones look absolutely childish, like adult kindergartens in comparison. This is a game, a real game, that requires patience and skill and gifts so many hours of joy that it's going to be the benchmark for years to come. It also had cool boss fights, Ancestor Beast in its eerie beauty, its jaw-dropping sound design, Renalla and how bloody weird her concept is, the fun of cheesing Commander O'Neill, the satisfying conclusion to Gideon Ofnir's questline, and even the thrill of learning and getting better at the aggressive bulldozer that is Radagon. Plenty of cool boss encounters, but given the sheer volume of encounters, it shouldn't be surprising that there's repetition, that some are a letdown, that not all of them feel like a narrative journey start to finish on their own. That, dear friends, is all I have to say about Elden Ring. I hope you enjoyed watching if you got this far, and hopefully you'll stick around as I try to curb my laziness and get out a few more videos. Take care, keep washing your hands, I'll see you later.